I will be analyzing the play Dr. Voynich and Her Children by Leanna Keyes from the Methuen Drama Book of Trans Plays. So, what are the basics of Dr. Voynich and Her Children by Leanna Keyes? Well, first thing that you need to know about the setting is that it takes place in a mobile dispensary of herbal medicine, as is referenced in the script. It is on the side of a highway in a place called the Heartland. The Heartland is a small piece of land that is very separate from the rest of this United States, where this is right on the border of a land that is less controlled by law enforcement and a land that is very controlled by law enforcement. The time that is written down in the script is the near future, God help us. This show explicitly takes place after a second Trump administration, not from Donald Trump, but from Ivanka Trump. Dr. Rue Voynich and her apprentice Fade travel the American heartland dispensing herbal medications. Covertly, they perform abortions, long ago made illegal. Fade tries to help local youth Hannah complete her abortion using knowledge from an ancient manuscript before her mother and the sheriff can nail them for the attempted murder of an unborn person. I will be going through each of the distinguishing characteristics on their own. So the first characteristic of rhetorical discourse is that it is planned. Now, obviously, a play with no plan will never get published unless there's a specific vision for where it is going and how it's structured. It will not get published. It will not get performed. Plays go through dozens, if not thousands, of revisions over the course of their histories, but you always have to start with a cohesive idea and a plan for where it's going to go. So it is pretty clear that as a play, this piece of rhetoric is planned. It is also adapted to an audience. Out of the many forms of rhetoric, theater is one of which where it is most obviously adapted to an audience, but perhaps it's not as specific of an audience. As Herrick says on page 10, audience should not be understood strictly in the traditional sense of a large group of people seated in rows of chairs in a large hall. For most rhetoric, this is true. It's not necessarily a literal audience, but for a play, it likely would be. However, the context in which I have consumed this media is through reading it, so the audience that I perceive with this piece of media would be different because I have never seen it in person. I was not that type of audience. I was the person reading it, which would be a slightly different audience. And so the audience for people reading the play would likely be people who prescribe to more progressive ideologies, women, queer people, trans people, people who are pro-choice. All of those are themes that are woven in through the story. There is a woman who gets an abortion. One of the main characters is trans. There are several queer main characters, and nearly everyone, if not everyone in the play, could be considered a woman. So it would appeal to those groups a little bit more. If we're seeking to persuade, perhaps this wouldn't be the audience, but for just consuming it as a piece of entertainment, that would be the audience. It reveals human motives. Theater and performance often explores why humans do things. Herrick says on page 11, the history of rhetoric is replete with efforts to understand human values, identify factors prompting audiences to action, and to grasp the symbolic resources for drawing people together. That means that rhetoric is not necessarily about exposing why humans do things, but utilizing those motives to push a point. Many of these characters make choices for completely rational reasons in context of the play. One of the characters gets an abortion because she simply can't support the baby and she doesn't want to have it. That is a completely rational, relatable reason to getting an abortion. Something like that is not necessarily universal, but it does reveal human motives and it uses them to make a point. One of the characters defies her boss / caretaker because they believe it's the right thing to do. That is a universal experience. Many of us have done things that were perhaps not what other people want us to do because we believe it's the right thing to do. That's what makes these characters relatable. That's what gets the audiences to engage with them in a way that would make this a piece of rhetoric that pushes an idea and successfully makes an argument. This play is responsive. It responds to conservative ideologies gaining traction. That's the context in which it was written. The political climate in general has a huge impact on this book. In the setting, things are extremely split between more progressive lands and lands that are a little bit more unlawful, perhaps, or a bit more wild in terms of law enforcement engagement. But it is also response inviting. That's a big point of rhetoric for Herrick, that rhetoric is also response inviting. This play may prompt a response from someone with a slightly different view. It might invite a more visceral reaction from them. But it invites the audience to engage with the show and make their own points in response. It urges people to look closer at the consequences of legislature. That is how it seeks persuasion. The author tries to get people to empathize with queer people, with women, with people who want abortions. She humanizes those characters so that people connect with them and feel for them more and want them to succeed, thereby pushing her political ideas. Rhetorical discourse often seeks to influence an audience to accept an idea and then to act, as Herrick says on page 12. Meaning, this play addresses issues that are not entirely impossible. That's how it gets the audience to accept an idea, and that's how it addresses contingent issues. The events of the show are not entirely implausible. We have lived through a Trump administration. We have lived through Roe v. Wade being overturned. The things that happen in this book are not entirely out of the question, and decisions are made continuously through the plot that make sense in this context. Nothing is inevitable and nothing is impossible in a fictional world, but the fact that this one so closely resembles one that could plausibly be our own is what draws the audience in. As Herrick says, when there are alternatives to be weighed and matters are neither inevitable nor impossible, we are facing contingent issues that invite the use of rhetoric. Nothing is inevitable, nothing is impossible. Anything can happen in this context, and these problems that are being proposed are not ones that are impossible for our own world either. And that's what makes it so engaging as a text, and that's what makes it effective as a piece of rhetoric. The social functions involved in this text, it definitely tests ideas. It proposes a hypothetical situation in response to Roe v. Wade being overturned. It's a hypothetical situation in which abortions are completely illegal, but they're performed anyway because that knowledge will always still exist. It provides a peaceful way to test ideas publicly, as Herrick likes to call it. It also assists advocacy by allowing audiences to view unconventional queer relationships on stage. It encourages them to think about what will actually happen if far-right ideologies continue to make their way into our government. Furthermore, it encourages the audience to do something about it. It provides a voice for these ideas and pushes the audience to do something about it. It gives them a means to test their own ideas and see these things and want to do something about it. In that way, it also distributes power. It is a show by a queer woman. It uplifts the voices of women and queer people, including trans women on stage, who we don't often see on stage in roles that have nothing to do with their gender. Now, it is not necessarily true that these characters have nothing to do with the gender of the actors, but they are constructed in ways that will allow for broader depth, and that's very important. It discovers facts about relationships and the resilience of human nature, but that's not as prominent an idea because this is not a nonfiction text. But it does shape knowledge by breaking down stereotypes about various groups, including lesbians, trans women, and people who get abortions. There are a lot of stereotypes about these people that are not good, and it uses these stereotypes to break them down and test those ideas so that communities can accept it. And in that way, it also builds community. Viewing a show automatically creates a community because it is a shared experience, but it also encourages people to band together and do something in politics. It urges people to take a stand and do something about it. The characteristics of discipline that I think relate most to my personal interests are the characteristic of being adapted to an audience. I really love theater, as you can tell by the fact that I analyzed a play for this assignment. But theater is always adapted to an audience. The way I exist also is adapting to whoever I'm speaking to, which is common in pretty much everyone, but especially in neurodivergent people. And however I speak is just reflecting whoever I'm speaking to and their style of speech. And so my rhetoric is dependent on other people's rhetoric in style. Also, revealing human motives. Again, theater has a big focus on revealing human motives and being realistic in that sense. But also the literature I read is often very abstract and metaphorical, or they have very strong themes about the way humanity exists and functions, or capitalist critique and things like that, but it's revealing why we do things and exploring those ideas. The functions that pertain to my personal interests are distributing power. I'm very interested in the ideas of redistributing power and listening to minorities, seeing their art, and how we can use art to take back power that has been taken from us. I am myself someone who perhaps would not have the power to express ideas freely without certain types of rhetoric. And I love literature that subverts expectations, gives people a voice in perhaps unconventional ways. I really just like unconventional forms of rhetoric, and that is very common when the purpose is to distribute power differently, because it is more attention grabbing and can function as a signal to other people in that community, even going from style to style, seeing that connection and making the connection. Also, discovering facts. I love to research. I constantly want to learn more about things. I have always been a big researcher, and that's been one of my passions for quite a long time, so discovering facts through rhetoric is very interesting to me. As for in my discipline, in my career, I want to be a English or theater professor, and the characteristics that most pertain to that are it's adapting to an audience. As a teacher, adapting to students' needs and backgrounds is absolutely crucial. Everything depends on who you're talking to. If you're teaching in a specific way to students that don't learn that way very well, it's not going to go very well. So you really have to know your students and know how to speak to them, how to teach them things. It's also responsive. Lessons need to respond to needs determined by either curriculum or students' needs. They need to be updated to the times, teaching modern literature and theater, keeping up with modern ideals for things like in feminist theater or other political motivations behind contemporary art. It's really important to talk about current events along with the history of it. Also, it's planned. Lessons rarely go well if they're off the cuff. Planning out lessons ensures clarity and makes sure that people are actually retaining that information and you're performing it in a way that makes sense and is easy to take in. The functions that pertain to my discipline are shaping knowledge. As a teacher, that's the main goal. The main goal is to teach people things and have them retain it in their own way. Also, assisting advocacy. As a teacher, that's another goal, allowing students the space to express their own ideas and speak up for themselves, because youth is so important, and the more kind and accepting we are to future generations, the more kind and accepting the world will be. The more that we allow those students to lift their voices and distribute the power back to them by educating students, we give them a chance to use their own forms of rhetoric and lift their own voices. We give them an opportunity to have the power to say something about the world, and that is so crucial to express to them that that is something they can do. Also, testing ideas. In discussions, I want to establish a community where people can test ideas without fear of judgment and actually dig deeper into concepts, because everybody has a different perspective to bring to the table. The way that I interpret something is not going to be the same as somebody else interpreting it, because we have different lived experiences. And through rhetoric, we can show those ideas and we can challenge each other and actually have a productive conversation and really dig deeper into what we're talking about, because we have different lived experiences. And that's very important as a teacher. So rhetoric is involved in all parts of my life, but it is especially important in my discipline and in my career I'm pursuing.